Okay, so you want to become a pirate. Grab a ship, fly a black flag, raid a few merchant vessels, and retire rich somewhere warm. Simple enough plan. And from a distance, from the comfortable distance of history books and Hollywood, it almost sounds reasonable. Here's what that plan actually cost. And here's why the people who made the real money during the Golden Age of Piracy were almost never the ones standing on the deck with a cutlass. Start with the world that made piracy possible. Because pirates didn't create the market they were stealing from, they inherited it. By the late 17th century, the Atlantic Ocean had become the busiest commercial highway in human history. European empires were running plantation economies across the Americas. The British East India Company held monopoly rights over vast swaths of Indian Ocean trade, and triangular trade routes were moving sugar, slaves, tobacco, rum, and textiles in volumes that the world had never seen. The Spanish Asiento contract alone committed to supplying a minimum of 4,800 enslaved individuals per year to Spanish colonies. The sheer volume of concentrated wealth moving slowly across enormous, largely unpoliced oceans was unprecedented. And pirates, it turned out, were very good at reading a market. Consider the scale of what was actually moving across those oceans. A single sugar plantation in Barbados could generate revenue equivalent to several English noble estates. The trade in tobacco from Virginia was worth millions of pounds sterling annually by the early 18th century. The British East India Company's dividend to its shareholders some years exceeded 50%. The ocean wasn't just a highway. It was the primary mechanism by which the early modern world transferred wealth across hemispheres. And it was essentially unguarded. Now, the mythology of piracy fixates on treasure, gold doubloons, pieces of eight, galleons groaning with Spanish silver. But the economic reality was far more practical, and in some ways more interesting. The most profitable pirate raids often had nothing to do with precious metals. A ship loaded with sugar and rum could be extraordinarily valuable. Tobacco functioned almost like currency in colonial markets. Naval stores, pitch tar, canvas, were consumed directly by the pirate fleet to stay operational. Weapons and ammunition could be reinvested immediately into the next raid. Even ordinary commercial cargo, the kind being moved on thousands of ships every year across the Atlantic, could yield enormous returns when you captured 100% of the profit margin and paid nothing to produce, harvest, or transport any of it. The only cost was the raid itself. That asymmetry is the foundation of the entire pirate economy. But running a successful pirate operation required far more than a ship and a willingness to fight. This is where most people's mental model of piracy breaks down. Because piracy was not random robbery on the high seas. It was a highly organized, capital-intensive, illegal supply chain. To sustain a maritime campaign, you needed a seaworthy vessel, preferably fast and heavily armed. You needed food, water, gunpowder, shot, rope, sails, tools for repairs, and surgeons who could keep a crew functional after combat. You needed ports that would receive you without turning you over to the Navy. You needed merchants who would buy what you stole without asking too many questions. And you needed information, which we'll get to in a moment, because without information, you were sailing blind across millions of square miles of open ocean, burning through food and water and time, looking for ships that were never where you expected them to be. This need for logistics gave rise to a remarkable shadow infrastructure. Pirates established autonomous safe havens and trading posts, most famously on the island of Madagascar and Ile Sainte-Marie in the Indian Ocean. A former privateer named Adam Baldridge recognized the commercial opportunity and set up a trading post on St. Mary's Island in the 1690s, importing general goods from American colonies and trading them to pirate crews in exchange for their plundered wealth. This was not an accident. This was a man identifying a market inefficiency and positioning himself in the middle of it. The pirate supply chain created its own ecosystem of brokers, suppliers, informants, port operators, and buyers. Remove any one of those elements and the entire operation collapses. Now here's the piece that most people never think about when they imagine pirates. Information. In the vast expanse of the open ocean, sailing randomly in search of a target was an economically catastrophic strategy. The expected value was negative. You'd burn through your provisions, wear out your crew, and have nothing to show for it. The pirates who actually made money were the ones who knew where the money was before they left port. They needed to know departure schedules, trade routes, cargo manifests, and the defensive capabilities of specific vessels. And so an intelligence network emerged around the pirate economy. Merchants, disgruntled sailors, tavern keepers, corrupt colonial officials, all feeding information into a system where it had real monetary value. When Captain Henry Every achieved what historians consider the most lucrative single pirate raid in history, he didn't stumble upon his target. He positioned his fleet at the Mandab Strait, a natural choke point between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, and waited specifically for a wealthy Mughal convoy returning from Mocha. He knew the route, he knew the timing, he knew the value of the cargo. Information made that raid possible. The cutlasses just finished the job. Now step back and think about the pirates themselves, not as criminals, but as economic actors making rational decisions under conditions of enormous uncertainty, because the supply of pirate labor didn't emerge from nowhere. It emerged from the most brutal labor market in the 18th century world. Legitimate maritime employment. For the average merchant sailor of this era, the sea was already a death sentence delivered slowly. Starvation-level rations, cramped, diseased quarters, violent discipline administered by captains who had absolute legal authority over their crew. Payment fraud was common. When wars ended and the labor market flooded with unemployed sailors, merchants simply cut wages further, because they could. Sailors were treated as the most disposable commodity in a world full of disposable people. Against that backdrop, piracy offered a different deal. Yes, the physical dangers were extreme: combat, disease, shipwreck, and the gallows. But the baseline conditions of legitimate sailing were already deadly. The difference was the return. A single successful pirate raid could yield more wealth than a sailor could accumulate in a lifetime of legitimate labor. The ocean was dangerous either way. Piracy simply redirected the economic rewards of that danger away from the shipowner and toward the crew. For a disenfranchised mariner calculating his odds, the choice was less obvious than it might appear from the outside. What made piracy even more economically rational was the internal structure of how pirate crews were organized and paid. This is one of the most genuinely surprising features of the entire era. Pirate crews operated under mutually agreed-upon articles of agreement, essentially written contracts, that established a flat and remarkably equitable compensation structure. Unlike the merchant marine, where profits flowed entirely upward to absentee shipowners and captains, pirates utilized profit sharing. The collective prize was divided into shares. Ordinary seamen received a single share each. Specialists, the carpenter, the surgeon, the gunner, received slightly more, typically 1.25 to 1.5 shares. The captain, who had absolute authority during battle, typically received only 2 shares. 2. In a world where merchant captains kept the lion's share, and their crews received a fixed wage regardless of cargo value, that narrow wage differential was extraordinary, and pirates pioneered something else that was genuinely ahead of its time: workers' compensation. Under Bartholomew Roberts' Articles of Agreement, a crew member who lost his right arm in combat received 800 pieces of 8 from the collective fund. Same for the left arm, same for a leg. Loss of an eye warranted proportionate compensation. These weren't informal arrangements or promises made in the heat of the moment. They were written into the contract before the crew ever left port. This guaranteed that men were willing to put their bodies into a fight, knowing that if they were maimed, the collective enterprise would sustain them. It was a direct solution to the principal-agent problem, the challenge of getting individuals to risk themselves for the collective benefit. If you liked this video so far, this is a good moment to subscribe to the channel and drop a like. It genuinely helps more people find content like this, and there's a lot more of it coming. Now, who was actually in charge of all this? Here's another piece that defies expectation. Aboard a pirate ship, the captain was not an absolute ruler. Pirate governance was surprisingly, almost shockingly, democratic. The captain was elected by the crew and held absolute authority only during combat. Outside of battle, administrative power rested with the quartermaster, also elected, who allocated provisions, distributed the loot, and adjudicated internal disputes. If a captain demonstrated poor judgment, showed cowardice, or began treating the crew like the merchant captains they had fled, he could be voted out. Multiple pirate captains were deposed this way. The crew had a mechanism for it. This sounds bizarre. Why would dangerous criminals operating entirely outside the law voluntarily submit to a rule-based structure? The answer is pure economics. Rules reduced internal friction. Predictable governance minimized the transaction costs of running a complex, high-risk enterprise. An organization riven by internal conflict wastes energy on itself that should be directed outward. The pirates who figured this out, and many of them did, ran more efficient, more profitable operations as a result. They had essentially stumbled onto something that modern organizational theory would later formalize. Every attack, of course, carried potential costs that had to be weighed against potential rewards. Death in combat, debilitating injury, damage to the pirate vessel, which was the single most valuable asset the crew collectively owned, depletion of irreplaceable ammunition, and always, the possibility of capture and execution. The pirate business model worked only when the expected value of successful raids outweighed these probability-adjusted costs. This calculus dictated everything. It dictated target selection. Pirates overwhelmingly preferred slow, heavily laden, weakly defended merchantmen, not because they were afraid of a fight, but because attacking a heavily armed naval frigate offered a high probability of death and zero commercial reward. It dictated routing, where to patrol, which straits to watch, which trade routes offered the best concentration of targets. And it dictated the most counterintuitive feature of the entire pirate economy: the strategic restraint on violence. Here's the psychological and economic twist that most people miss entirely. If merchant sailors believed that surrendering to pirates guaranteed their execution, they had a rational incentive to fight to the death. Every ship that chose to fight rather than surrender dramatically increased the pirates' operational costs. Damaged cargo, sunken vessels, dead crew members, depleted ammunition, all for a prize that might be destroyed in the fighting. Unnecessary violence was economically counterproductive. So instead, pirates invested in reputation management. The Jolly Roger, the skull and crossbones, was not primarily a symbol of menace. It was an economic signaling device. It communicated a very specific proposition: surrender immediately, and you will be spared. Resist, and you will be shown no mercy. By cultivating a precisely calibrated reputation for ruthlessness against those who resisted and relative leniency toward those who didn't, pirates could lower the cost of each acquisition dramatically. In the vast majority of documented pirate encounters, the mere appearance of the black flag was sufficient. No shot fired, no cargo damaged, no crew member lost. The threat of violence backed by a credible reputation was the product. The ship and its cargo were just the delivery. And cargo wasn't the only prize. The vessel itself represented massive capital. A captured merchant ship could be integrated into the pirate fleet to expand operational capacity. It could be stripped for its guns and rigging. It could replace a pirate vessel that had become fouled with barnacles or heavily damaged in combat. This mechanism of capital accumulation meant that successful pirates could scale their operations without ever going to a shipyard or arranging debt financing. They acquired assets directly from the global shipping network. One captured ship provided the resources to pursue a larger ship. A larger ship enabled a larger crew. A larger crew enabled bigger, more lucrative targets. This is a classic reinforcing feedback loop, the same structure that drives the most aggressive phases of any expanding business. Captain Bartholomew Roberts captured more than 400 vessels over the course of his career by continuously upgrading his fleet and his force. Henry Every assembled a coalition of pirate ships, including a 46-gun frigate called the Fancy, specifically to overwhelm a Mughal state vessel named the Ganj-i-Sawai, one of the most heavily armed merchant ships in the Indian Ocean, resulting in a haul estimated at somewhere between 325,000 and 600,000 pounds sterling. In modern terms, somewhere north of $100 million from a single engagement, but there's a bottleneck in this model that every successful pirate eventually ran into. Stealing commodities in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean is economically useless unless you can convert those commodities into money. Stolen sugar is just sugar. Stolen textiles are just cloth. You cannot spend them directly, and you cannot walk into a legitimate market and sell them without questions being asked. This is why the most important market in the pirate economy wasn't the ocean. It was the land. Piracy spawned a massive secondary economy of fences, smugglers, corrupt merchants, and port operators who purchased stolen goods at 50 to 80% below market value and resold them at premium rates into colonial markets desperate for affordable goods. European mercantilist policies artificially restricted trade and inflated prices throughout the colonies. Pirated goods, sold cheaply and without import duties, were enormously attractive to colonial populations who had few alternatives. Prominent figures like Frederick Phillips in New York leveraged their political connections to sponsor trading posts specifically designed to move Indian Ocean pirate loot directly onto New York store shelves. Colonial populations bought these goods eagerly. The fences made fortunes. The pirates took the risks. The land-based intermediaries captured the margin. Here's where the story takes its most important historical turn. European governments did not simply tolerate maritime plunder. They institutionalized it. During periods of geopolitical conflict, states issued documents called letters of marque to private individuals, legally authorizing them to attack enemy shipping. These privateer captains were, in legal terms, pirates operating with government permission. The distinction between a privateer and a pirate was literally a piece of paper, and that piece of paper depended entirely on whether your country happened to be at war with the country whose ship you were plundering. Privateering was, from a government's perspective, an extraordinarily cost-effective arrangement. You got the economic disruption of attacking enemy trade without paying for a navy to do it. The private sector bore the risk. The state collected the geopolitical benefit. The prize money went to the privateer. The strategic advantage went to the crown. On paper, it was a perfect public-private partnership. In practice, it was a program for manufacturing pirates with government funding and government training and government authorization. And then, when the geopolitical climate shifted, simply declaring those same men criminals and expecting them to stop. But this arrangement came with a structural consequence that no one seemed to adequately anticipate. Privateering created a massive workforce of sailors who were highly skilled in the specific arts of boarding, artillery, plunder, and the management of captured vessels. Governments effectively funded the research and development of piracy, creating an industrial pipeline of trained talent, and then the wars ended. The conclusion of the War of the Spanish Succession around 1713 and 1714 was the triggering event. The British Royal Navy shed personnel rapidly, from approximately 53,000 sailors at the height of the conflict to just 13,000 in peacetime. Thousands of privateers found their letters of marque suddenly worthless. The labor market was flooded overnight with heavily armed, highly trained, now unemployed men who had spent years learning exactly one marketable skill: how to take things from ships by force. For most of them, the alternative was returning to merchant sailing, starvation wages, brutal discipline, and the same life they'd been living before the war made them briefly valuable. Some took that path. Others did the economic calculation and reached a different conclusion. The skills that made them useful to the state during wartime didn't disappear when the war ended. The ships were still out there. The cargo was still moving. The enforcement was as weak as it had ever been. The only thing that changed was the legal paperwork. And so the Golden Age began. The period from roughly 1716 to 1726 is classified as the Golden Age not because pirates were suddenly bolder or more violent than before, but because of a specific and temporary alignment of macroeconomic conditions. Expanding international trade created a target-rich environment. The end of European wars flooded the labor market with experienced maritime manpower. Colonial wealth extraction meant valuable cargo was moving constantly across poorly policed oceans. Corrupt colonial officials provided cover and market access. Black markets provided liquidity. Weak naval enforcement provided operating room. No single factor caused the Golden Age. It was the simultaneous optimization of supply, labor and ships, demand fences and black markets, and favorable regulatory conditions, an absence of effective policing that allowed the shadow economy to thrive at genuine scale. But the reality of pirate life never matched the mythology. And this is where the economic picture gets considerably darker. The pirate lifestyle was characterized by an enormous risk premium that most people who entered the game never actually collected on. The disease was endemic: scurvy, malaria, tropical fevers that could decimate a crew within weeks. Malnutrition was constant. Combat injuries were catastrophic in an era before effective medicine. Hurricanes cared nothing for the Articles of Agreement. And the institutional banking system did not extend to known pirates, which meant that the shares a crew member earned from a successful raid were typically spent immediately in whatever port would have them. Tomorrow was never guaranteed. Many pirates squandered their wealth the moment they had it, out of rational cynicism. Why save money you might never live to spend? The result was that most rank-and-file pirates died either at sea from disease and violence, or at the gallows, with very little to show for the risk they'd accepted. The business offered the possibility of immense wealth. The statistical reality for most was, as one contemporary observer put it, a merry life and a short one. Now let's talk about the moment the business model broke. Piracy had initially flourished on the periphery of empire, in the vast spaces where state power was thin. But as the pirate economy scaled, it began generating negative externalities that threatened the financial architecture of the European states themselves. Insurance rates, underwritten by prominent institutions including the predecessors of Lloyd's of London, skyrocketed as piracy risk grew. Merchant ships were forced to carry heavier armament and larger crews, inflating operating costs across the entire global trading system. Commodity prices rose, security expenditures rose, trade routes were disrupted, and then Henry Every's raid on the Ganjai Sawai in 1695 pushed the entire situation past a tipping point. Emperor Aurangzeb of the Mughal Empire, one of the wealthiest and most powerful rulers on earth, responded by closing key English trade ports in India. The British East India Company filed an insurance claim for £350,000 and launched a lobbying campaign that resulted in the world's first global manhunt. Bounties of £1,000 were posted for every named pirate. The British government was forced to recognize at last that the macroeconomic cost of piracy now vastly outweighed any benefit derived from tolerating colonial smuggling. To break the pirate economy, governments couldn't simply send more ships. They had to structurally change the incentive equation. The dual-pronged approach they eventually deployed was elegant in its economic logic. In 1718, the British government dispatched Woodes Rogers, himself a former privateer. which tells you something, to Nassau in the Bahamas, which had become the operating base of a loosely organized pirate network known as the Flying Gang. Rogers carried two weapons. The first was the Act of Grace, a royal proclamation offering full pardons to any pirate who surrendered voluntarily. This was a rational, cost-free exit from a market that was rapidly becoming lethal. It gave men a way out without execution. The second weapon was the elimination of that exit for anyone who refused it. Naval patrols were reinforced. Vice Admiralty courts were established locally so captured pirates could be tried and executed quickly without the expense and delay of transporting them to London. Former pirates like Benjamin Hornigold were paid bounties to hunt down their former colleagues. Men who knew exactly where other pirates operated, exactly which ports they used, and exactly how they thought. The crackdown targeted every pillar of the pirate supply chain simultaneously. The safe havens, fencing networks, the corrupt officials, and the labor supply by offering a safe exit while drastically increasing the probability and speed of death for anyone who declined it. Governments collapsed the expected payoff calculation entirely. Once the math shifted, mass defections followed. By 1726, the Golden Age was effectively over. Before you go, if you want to go deeper on how to think about risk, capital, and building something from the ground up, the kind of economic thinking that runs through stories like this one, there's a detailed business guide available in the description and pinned in the first comment. It's not about pirates specifically, but it's about the same underlying principles of how people build, scale, and lose enterprises. Worth a read if this kind of thinking interests you. Run the two scenarios that define this entire era. In the optimistic version, the one that drew thousands of men toward the Black Flag, a crew of 60 operates out of Nassau, captures 4 or 5 merchantmen in a season, splits a haul worth several £1,000s, and disperses before the Navy can respond. The captain retires, the crew finds work. Nobody hangs. The math in that scenario is genuinely compelling. In the realistic version, which is what actually happened to the vast majority of pirate operations, the crew runs low on provisions by the 3rd month. A ship fights back harder than expected. 2 men die. The vessel needs repairs no one can afford. The intelligence was bad, and the target ship they were waiting for left port 3 days early. By the time they take a prize worth anything, they're operating in waters where the Royal Navy has tripled its patrols. The gap between those two scenarios is measured not in luck, but in the systematic dismantling of every condition that made the business possible in the first place. Return, one final time, to the economics. The Golden Age of Piracy was not an aberration of human morality. It was an extreme and highly efficient form of spatial and regulatory arbitrage. The exploitation of an enormous gap between the value of commodities moving through under-policed oceans and the cost of enforcing ownership over them. The pirates were rational actors responding to the incentives in front of them, brutal labor conditions on one side, massive potential rewards on the other, and a temporary window of weak enforcement wide enough to operate through. They built remarkably sophisticated organizational structures: democratic governance, equitable profit sharing, workers' compensation, strategic brand management through the Jolly Roger. Not out of idealism, but because those structures made the business more profitable. And yet, the ultimate irony is this. The people who accepted the most risk were rarely the people who kept the most money. The fences who bought stolen goods at 60 cents on the dollar and resold them at full market price. The corrupt colonial governors who looked the other way in exchange for a share. The merchants who stocked their shelves with pirated goods and pocketed the margin. The privateering syndicates and their wealthy land-based investors who captured the gains of wartime plunder while the sailors bore the physical cost. The pirate was the extraction mechanism for a much larger economic machine. The machine itself was operated by people who never left shore. The economic forces that created the Golden Age never disappeared. Whenever highly valuable assets move through environments where enforcement is weak, information is asymmetric, rewards are enormous, and risks can be shifted onto people with no other options, illicit markets emerge. The wooden galleons are gone. The institutional architecture of piracy, the profit-sharing models, the safe haven networks, the information asymmetries, the reliance on intermediaries for market liquidity appears today in international cybercrime, sanctions evasion, in every shadow economy that exploits the gap between where value moves and where power can reach. Modern ransomware syndicates operate affiliate models where developers and attackers split the ransom in arrangements that would have been immediately familiar to any pirate quartermaster from 1720. They use cryptocurrency tumblers the way Golden Age pirates used colonial merchants, to convert stolen value into spendable wealth without drawing attention. They operate from jurisdictions with weak extradition treaties the way pirates operated from Nassau and Madagascar. The specific technology changes entirely. The economic logic underneath it never does. The pirates disappeared. The economics of piracy never did. If you found this video worthwhile, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and leave a like. It takes 2 seconds and it genuinely makes a difference to how this content reaches new people. Thank you for watching. More of this coming soon.